What were the three primary products produced by slaves that we still demand today? Tobacco, cotton, and sugar. Tobacco became a cash crop for the South. The revenue was used to pay fines, taxes, and to purchase more slaves. Tobacco required a very large workforce. The enslaved had to plant, trim, cure, and harvest and package the crop. Tobacco was also subject to insects and diseases. What made tobacco a primary demand is because it was addictive. Now, cotton was harvested by hand. It was easy to grow, but difficult to process. The evolution of the cotton gin made it easier to separate the seeds from the fiber, but the cotton still had to be picked. The demand by the textile industry in the North and in Great Britain drove the demand for more labor. However, the cotton gin made the product more profitable. Now for sugar, the profitability lied in the Europeans' demand for it, along with the demands of molasses and rum. While tobacco and cotton created a demand in the Americas, sugar created a demand internationally. A good book that I recommend for your Black History library is 400 Souls by Ibram X. Kendi and Keisha N. Blaine. This video, we're going to cover a few points about the Civil War. The primary cause of the Civil War was chattel slavery. Chattel slavery was extremely profitable to the South. Profits made by forced labor. The more the South made profit, the more they wanted to expand chattel slavery into the new territories. The North opposed slavery and did not want to expand it into new territories. The North's economy was based on industry, not plantation and agriculture like the South. The North also feared that expanding chattel slavery into the new territories would undermine their political power and their economic growth. Herein lies the conflict. The South, with their strong desire to continue the dehumanization of chattel slavery, took up arms and succeeded from the Union. Abraham Lincoln solicited blacks to fight for the Union against the South. Frederick Douglass, a prominent abolitionist, encouraged them to do the same. About 200,000 blacks, including former slaves, fought in the Union. And on April 9, 1865, the South surrendered. Today, you will hear various reasons why the Civil War started. Have no doubt about it, Civil War started because of chattel slavery. Now, a book I would recommend is Black Writers and the American Civil War by Richard A. Long. Following the collapse of the Reconstruction era, the South entered a period known as Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws allowed for the racial segregation and the disenfranchisement of Black Americans. These laws allowed for Black Americans to be stripped of their political and social gains made during Reconstruction. Jim Crow laws was America's legal racial discrimination practice that remained in place for nearly 100 years. These laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. These laws were meant to marginalize African Americans, to deny them jobs, to deny them the right to vote, and to deny them education. Those who attempted to defy Jim Crow were often faced with arrest, jail, fines, and even death. Thomas Dartmouth Rice, an actor born in New York, developed a backstage character known as Jim Crow. With quick dance moves, exaggerated vernacular, and buffoonish behavior, Rice founded the new genre of racial song and dance known as Blackface. White performers playing Blackface perpetuated a range of negative stereotypes, including being lazy, ignorant, hypersexual, and criminal. This was highlighted in the 1915 film Birth of a Nation. The film highlights Black characters, many played in blackface, as unintelligent and sexually aggressive towards white women. The Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist group, is portrayed as heroic that protects white women and maintains white supremacy. For this video, I highly recommend the book, Jim Crow, Lecture and Legacy of Sutton E. Griggs. Black codes were Jim Crow laws passed in the South that restricted the rights of African American people. They were designed to limit the rights of Black American people and make sure that they were available for cheap labor. The best way to describe black codes is to think of it as black codes of conduct, because they were laws that supported discrimination. Black Americans had no option to rebel against this injustice without consequences. Black codes consist of Vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws made it a crime to be unemployed or idle without a job. Contract laws. Contract laws required black people to sign a yearly contract with an employer, but they could be penalized if the contract was not fulfilled. Property restrictions. Property restrictions limited the type of property that black people could purchase. Criminal penalties. Penalties considered minor offenses resulted in harsh penalties and fines. Limited access to rights. Limited access to rights denied black people the right to vote, serve on jurors, testify against white people, or to obtain a job without a previous employer's signature. Black codes also required that a black person could not look a white person in the eye unless they were told to do so. When passing on the sidewalk, the black person had to step off the sidewalk to allow the white person to pass, and the black person could not call the white person by their first name unless they were instructed to do so. To give you an idea about black codes, I'm going to share with you my own personal story. In the early 1960s, I was approximately 8 years old. My sister was maybe 9 years old. We went to visit my grandmother down in the state of Tennessee. While we were down there, my mother, my sister, and I accompanied my grandmother to the local store so that she could cash a check. This store served multiple functions. It was a general store, it was a bank, and it was the bus station. While in line to cash her check, a white person walked in. We saw my grandmother lower her head and step back to allow the white person to step in front of her. After a few minutes, when my grandmother got a little closer, another white person walked in. My grandmother repeated her same action. She lowered her head, stepped back, and allowed the white person to step in front of her. A couple of minutes later, another white person came in, but it was at that point that my mother spoke out. My mother being from the north in Toledo, Ohio, not knowing what the rules were down in the south. And my mother said, if another person steps in front of her, let me tell you all something. Her money is just as good as anybody else's that's in here. Suddenly, a small murmuring began. With the murmuring, small crowds began to gather. The murmur got louder and the crowd got larger. All of a sudden, my uncle and my father rushed in the store. They grabbed my grandmother, my mother, me and my sister, and rushed us back to my grandmother's house, who lived approximately 5 minutes away. Immediately, we had to pack our bags, and then we went back to that same location. But this time, the bus was there. My uncle and my father hastily put us on the bus so that we could return back to Toledo safe and sound. I had no idea what I witnessed at the age of 8, but it was later on in life, through my studies of black history, that I learned this was an example of black codes. In 1988, a rap group called NWA released a title called F the Police. As controversial as the statement was, the deeper issue was the continuous use of excessive force being administered in black communities and communities of color versus white communities. There has been a long-standing issue with law enforcement using excessive force upon black Americans since slavery, through Jim Crow, throughout current times. Many who do not witness such acts taking place in their communities cannot understand how some black Americans can take such an opposing position against those who are sworn to protect and serve. Throughout history, black America has always pointed towards equal protection under the law. And for us, that includes protection from the police, who have demonstrated the use of excessive force unnecessarily. To understand the historical relationship between the black communities and law enforcement, let's examine the evolution of the police force. Slave patrols were a form of law enforcement, and slave patrols influenced early policing in the South. Slave patrols consisted of a group of white men who captured runaway slaves and returned them to their owners. They were especially cruel in how they captured and punished runaway slaves. The use of slave patrols was a way for wealthy plantation owners to maintain their status quo. It was slave patrols that enforced black codes, which restricted the rights of blacks in America. As policing has evolved over the years, one thing has remained a constant, and that is for some officers, not all, but some officers' ability to hide behind the shield while they exercise excessive force unnecessarily without retribution. This has manifested more in communities of color more than anywhere else in America. Back in December of 2022, Lee Wayne produced a report by the Bureau of Justice. That report showed statistics that demonstrated that the use of excessive force was higher in Black communities. I recall a personal story back in 2016 when I had just landed at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, returning home from a business trip. My wife called me frantic and asked me if I had heard of what had just happened. When I looked into the matter, I learned that the police had been ambushed, 5 had been killed and 2 wounded. A Black gunman had gotten upset over the police shooting of Philander Castile in Minnesota and Alton Sterling in Louisiana. Later that evening, in an interview with Dr. Brian Williams, a trauma surgeon at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, echoed how deep this concern is. During that interview, Dr. Brian Williams said these words: "I will support you, I will take care of you, I will defend you, but that does not mean I do not fear you." Throughout the history of America, a false narrative has been pushed that the Black community does not have respect for law and order. On the contrary, our Black communities are not a bunch of savages. Our Black communities are not ignorant to social norms. Our Black communities, like any other community, just desire equal protection under the law, to include those who are sworn to protect and serve. A good book that I would recommend for your Black History library is The Bodies Keep Coming by Dr. Brian Williams. The Civil Rights era was a social movement in the United States from 1954 to 1968. Its aim was to abolish legal segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement that mostly impacted Black Americans. I will cover both civil rights figures and events over the next 2 videos. But in this video, I desire to show a significant reason for the lack of understanding of the plight of Blacks in America. In 2011, NPR, which is National Public Radio, released an article about a study they conducted on how much American schools were teaching about civil rights. I did a search for a recent study on the subject, but I was unable to identify one. In the article, it says that the Southern Poverty Law Center cites that the education about the civil rights movement in the United States is dismal. Their study assigned 35 states the grade of an F, and only 3 states, Alabama, New York, and Florida, received the grade of an A. Rather than recognizing the national significance of the civil rights movement, most states see it as a regional matter and a topic of interest mainly for Black students. 9 of the 12 highest scoring states are former Confederate states, but they are joined by Illinois, Maryland, and New York. Generally speaking, the further away from the South and the smaller the Black population, the least amount of attention is paid to the civil rights movement. I love the analogy that the article gave. The article wrote, imagine if children from Texas, California, and Minnesota were exempt from lessons on the American Revolution, or if students from Alaska, Hawaii, and Montana got a pass on the Civil War. We all recognize that the American Revolution and the Civil War were critical events in the growth of our nation and important enough for all students to study. It's time to recognize that the Civil Rights Movement, too, was one of those critical events that defines us as a nation. The Civil Rights Movement can serve as a reminder of how a self-governing nation can, if they choose, act collectively to correct a grave injustice. I have had the privilege of traveling all across the country, as well as overseas. In reference to the continental United States, I have been to 47 out of the 50 states, and I find it amazing that no matter where I go or who I talk to, male, female, white, Black, or different nationality, young or old, of how many people don't know basic things about Black history. or civil rights. This study, when I looked it up, clearly gave me an eye-opener, and maybe you too, on why we have a grave misunderstanding about the plight of blacks in America. The study clearly shows the lack of comprehensive study on the subject all across the country. The misconception of focus here is that many states see the civil rights movement as a regional issue and a primary focus only for black people. And we wonder why people make such statements as, well, why do we have to have Black history anyway? My answer, because of your lack of knowledge of our fact-based experiences that we've been sharing with you while unlocking Black history. A good book to add to your Black history library is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein.